only video that you might need to see about closure. So let's create a function which is a closure. I'll just say function and I'll say make multiple. Inside this I will have a variable multiply by, which I will give the value 2. It will return another function that will take an argument called I don't know what's happening. Then I'll just say let result. Okay, so now let's log this result. Now let's call this function. Okay, so this is what closure look like. We have this function which contains this variable. The function returns another function which will take that variable and multiply with whatever is passed in that function, right? So this is the standard case of closure. Closure basically means a function that is returning another function. So the use case of closure here is that this variable which is inside a closure is actually just private to the closure. Let me show you. So we just say console.log and try to access this multiply by. Then obviously I cannot access it here. If I just see here and refresh this, I'll get an error. Obviously multiply by is not defined because this is now a private variable which is just private to this function, and I cannot use this variable anywhere else except inside this function, right? So now whenever I call this function called make multiple here, and it will return this function. So that's the multiply will contain this function now, because this function is returning another function which is this which contains this operation, right? But the cool thing here is that whenever this function is executed in JavaScript, the variable multiply by is supposed to be destroyed, right? So whenever we execute a function in JavaScript, all of its variable get destroyed after the function is executed. But since it is a closure, the variable is not destroyed. Let me show you here. I'll just say multiply like this. So you can see here I'm logging multiply here, even though I'm assigning it here because of hosting in JavaScript. I'll just refresh this and go out here and show you here. Instead of console.log, I'll just say console.dir. Now if I see inside here, inside the scope, inside this make multiple, you can see here I get multiply by which contain 2, right? So the thing here is that whenever this function is executed, the variable was supposed to be destroyed, but since it is a closure, the variable is not destroyed. Instead it is saved inside this variable called, inside the scope we have this closure, and the variable is saved inside this closure instead of getting destroyed. And that's the reason why we can call this function. And since this multiply function also since this multiply function is this function which contains this multiply by, it can get this variable from the closure which is here, right? So that we can access that variable from the closure and we can get the value. So we can see the result here that when we pass 2, then we get here 4, and second time also we get the 4. But let's do something else here. I'll just update this multiply by each time. So I'll just multiply by plus plus, so that it is incremented by 1 once it is executed. So if I just refresh here, then first I get 4, and second I get 6, right? So whenever we call this function, it passed 2 here. Since the multiply by is 2 in the beginning, it will give me the value 4. But second time we call it, we're passing 2 here again, but now this time it is not actually 2, it is actually 3, because we have incremented it before, right? So instead of reinitializing the variable for each function, it just used that variable from closure. So we call this function, we get this variable from the closure which is 2 in the beginning, and then we increment it by 1, right? So the variable in closure now becomes 3. So now next time we call the function, we get the 3 which was the value from the closure, right? So the value persists between multiple functions. So that's the use case of closure. So basically there are 2 use cases of closure, and the first one is that data persists, whichever data we use here, it persists between all multiple functions. Another thing is that if we want this variable to be private, then we should make it inside closure. And also the variable inside the closure is not, closure function is not destroyed, it is actually saved inside this scope called closure. So those are the use case of closure, and that's how closure works in JavaScript.